The day I arrived at Voreth Station, I made 3 mistakes. The first was wearing my Earth-issued thermal jacket in a corridor calibrated for species that breathe ammonia. I nearly choked before I found the correct atmospheric section. The second mistake was asking a Velhari student for directions. She looked at me the way you look at a lost insect, not with cruelty, just with a kind of distant, scientific detachment, and then she walked away without saying a word. The third mistake was thinking those first 2 mistakes were the worst things that would happen to me. I was wrong about that last one, but I didn't know it yet. My name is Mira Osei. I was 19 years old. I was the first human being to receive a provisional scholarship to the Galactic Academy on Voreth Station, and as I stood in the arrivals corridor with one bag on my shoulder and a wrinkled letter of admission in my hand, I understood for the first time in my life what it means to be the only one. Not the only human, though that part was true too. The only anything. The station itself was vast in a way that made the word vast feel too small to use. It did not look the way humans tend to imagine alien architecture looks. There were no sweeping silver spires or glowing purple domes. Voreth Station was old, centuries old. The kind of old that settles into walls and makes them look tired. The corridors were tall, very tall, because several of the species that walked them were 8 or 9 feet in height, and the ceilings curved in ways that made no geometric sense to human eyes. Lights ran along the walls in warm, slow pulses, adjusted automatically for the visual spectrum of whoever was passing. When I walked by, the lights shifted into the narrow band of wavelengths my eyes could use. They flickered slightly before finding the right frequency. Even the building needed a moment to figure out what I was. I didn't blame it. Most days, I needed a moment too. I had been selected from a competitive process run by the Earth Interstellar Education Coalition, a body of 12 universities, 3 space agencies, and one very determined woman named Director Amara Tete, who had spent 11 years convincing the Academy that humanity deserved a seat at the table. The scholarship was provisional. That word, provisional, sat at the bottom of my admission letter like a small stone in a shoe. It meant that I was here on good behavior. It meant that Earth's continued access to this institution depended, in some measure, on what I did with my time inside it. No pressure. I found my dormitory on the 4th attempt. It was a compact room on a section of the station reserved for what the Academy's administrative materials called non-standard biological students, which was a polite way of saying students who needed oxygen, couldn't tolerate ammonia, and required a bed instead of a suspension pod. There were 6 of us in that section, 4 Drathians, one creature I could never correctly identify because it changed shape depending on the temperature, and me. I was the only human being in a residential block of 4,000 students. I unpacked my bag. I set a photograph of my family on the small shelf above the sleeping platform, my mother in her garden in Accra, my grandmother at her desk, surrounded by papers, laughing at something my grandfather had said. My grandfather himself, standing in front of a flood control gate somewhere in the Netherlands, wearing a hard hat 2 sizes too large and looking very pleased with himself. I straightened the photograph. I sat down on the edge of the sleeping platform. I breathed. Then I opened my course schedule and started reading. The Galactic Academy offered 412 courses in its current term. I had been assigned to 6 of them, chosen by the admissions committee based on my entrance exam results and what I suspected was a coin toss. 5 of the 6 courses were in fields I recognized, at least in part: physics, mathematics, systems engineering, planetary ecology, and a course called Comparative Technological History, which sounded manageable. The 6th course was listed simply as Adaptive Crisis Mathematics, taught by a Professor Keth Valos of the Solhari faculty. I didn't know what the Solhari were yet. I would find out. The first morning of classes began before the station's simulated sunrise, a soft light cycle designed to accommodate the roughly 40 different species attending the academy, none of whom shared the same natural sleep rhythm. I was awake before the lights changed anyway. I have always been an early riser, which my mother considers a personality flaw and my grandmother considered a survival skill. I think my grandmother was right about most things. I dressed, checked my course map 3 times, and walked to Lecture Hall 7 on the eastern ring of the station's academic quarter. The hall was larger than I expected. It rose 5 stories, with tiered seating arranged in a wide semicircle around a central presentation platform. The seats were designed to accommodate multiple body types. Some were flat benches, some were angled platforms for species with different skeletal arrangements, some were circular pads for students who preferred to coil or fold rather than sit. I found a standard bench near the back, middle row, and settled in. Students arrived in groups and alone. The Velhari twins came in together. I recognized them from the corridor the previous day, though one had been the one who walked away from me without speaking. and I wasn't entirely sure which twin that had been. They were tall and silver pale, with wide dark eyes and a way of moving that suggested they were always in agreement with each other even when they weren't speaking. They took seats in the second row without looking around the room. A Drathian student came in next. I knew the Drathians from my preparatory reading, a species from a binary star system, known for their long academic tradition and a social structure built around hierarchy and inherited knowledge. He carried more data tablets than he could comfortably hold and arranged them on the bench beside him with great precision. His robe was deep blue with a silver border, and I later learned that the border indicated he was from one of his planet's most distinguished academic families. He sat in the front row without hesitation, as if the seat had been waiting for him his entire life. The Zune arrived last, or what I understood to be the Zune. I say what I understood, because the Zune are a collective species, meaning that what you see is not a single individual but a coordinated group of smaller organisms operating as one mind. The version that came to class that morning arranged itself in the wide circular seat to my left, and settled into a shape that vaguely suggested attention. I nodded at it. One of its surface eyes rotated toward me. I took that as a greeting and felt reasonably good about it. I counted 12 students in total. 12 students, one lecture hall big enough for 300, and one empty presentation platform that smelled faintly of something I could only describe as old light. Then Professor Keth Valos walked in. I had done my reading. I knew the Solhari were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the known galaxy, a civilization with a recorded history of over 8,000 years. They had contributed foundational theorems to galactic physics, developed the primary frameworks for interstellar navigation mathematics, and produced more Academy faculty members than any other species in the institution's 600-year existence. They were also, apparently, made of light. That is not precisely accurate, but it is the closest I can come in plain English. Professor Keth Valos had a body, a physical form, but it was translucent in the way that deep ocean water is translucent. You could see through him slightly, and the light in the room bent differently around his edges. He was tall, taller than any human, with long fingers that had one extra joint, and a face that contained 3 distinct mouths, arranged vertically, each one capable of independent expression. His eyes, 4 of them, were a soft, cold silver. He entered without ceremony, without greeting, and walked to the center of the presentation platform. He stood there for a moment and simply looked at the room. When his gaze reached me, it paused. Not for long. Maybe 2 seconds. But I felt it. It was the pause of someone encountering something unexpected in a familiar place. The way you pause when you find a word in a book you have read 100 times, and suddenly notice you have been mispronouncing it in your head for years. A small recalibration. Then he moved on. Adaptive crisis mathematics, he said. His voice came from all 3 mouths at slightly different intervals, giving it a harmonic quality that was strange and not unpleasant. This is not a theoretical course. Theory is what you study when everything is working correctly. This course is about what happens when it does not. He pulled up a holographic display above the platform, a spinning cluster of equations and system diagrams that I recognized, partly, from Earth's nuclear engineering literature. We will examine crisis scenarios across 12 categories of complex system failure: energy systems, atmospheric systems, biological cascade events, structural failures in deep space architecture. You will not be evaluated on your ability to recite solutions. You will be evaluated on your ability to construct them under conditions of incomplete information, limited time, and compounding variables. I was writing as fast as I could. Your backgrounds, he continued, letting his gaze travel the room again, are varied. Some of you come from species with centuries of practical experience in complex systems management. Some of you come from academic traditions that have produced the foundational mathematics this course will build upon. All of you, he said, and here his voice carried something that was not quite warmth, have been selected because you represent the intellectual capacity of your respective civilizations. He said all of you, the way you might say most of you, when you are being polite about an exception. I kept writing. The first session was mostly orientation, an overview of the course framework, the grading criteria, the types of problems we would face. Keth Valos moved through the material quickly, with the ease of someone who has explained the same thing many times and finds it interesting each time anyway, which is rare in any species. He was, I admitted to myself, an exceptional lecturer, clear, precise, unafraid of complexity. He was also, I noticed, careful to direct his explanatory comments toward the Velhari twins, the Drathian student, and the Zuan. When he asked a question to check understanding, his eyes moved to those 3, not to me. I was not invisible. I was something slightly different from invisible. I was present in the way a decorative element in a room is present. Noted, placed, not engaged with. I had experienced versions of this before. Not at this scale. Not in a room this far from home. But the feeling itself was not new to me. I knew what it was like to be the student a teacher doesn't quite look at. The person in a meeting who speaks and gets talked over. The name on a list that someone reads twice because it doesn't fit their expectations. I had learned, over 19 years, that the correct response to this feeling is not to perform loudly for attention. The correct response is to be ready when the moment arrives. So I kept writing. I kept listening. I did not raise my hand during that first session, but I was paying very close attention to everything. After class, the other students left quickly. The Drathian student gathered his tablets with careful precision and departed without speaking to anyone. The Velhari twins exchanged a few words in their own language and walked out together. The Zune redistributed its mass and flowed through the wider exit designed for larger format students. I was left alone in the large, quiet hall with my notes and a view of the holographic equations still rotating slowly above the platform, waiting to be dismissed. I sat there for a while and read through everything I had written. Then I pulled up the reading list Keth Valos had distributed and started at the beginning. The first text was a Solhari treatise on crisis mathematics written approximately 400 years ago, which meant it was roughly contemporary with Earth's early industrial period. The second was a collaborative work by a consortium of 6 species, covering what they called structured failure theory, the mathematical modeling of how complex systems collapse, and what shapes those collapses take. The third was a case study series on 5 actual events from galactic history: a reactor failure on a Drathian orbital station, an atmospheric cascade on a moon in the Velhari home system, a structural collapse in a deep space relay network, a biological failure event on a generation ship, and one other that had been partially redacted in the student version, which I found interesting. I read all 3 documents before dinner. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, there was no one to impress. I read them because I had come a very long way to be here, and the idea of not being prepared felt, to me, like a form of disrespect. To this place, to the opportunity, and to the woman whose photograph sat on the shelf above my sleeping platform, surrounded by papers, laughing. That evening, I sat at a small table in the station's shared dining area, a large, busy room where food replication units offered options for approximately 60 different biological requirements, and I ate something that the system had identified as nutritionally compatible with human physiology. It tasted like warm cardboard with mild ambition. I ate all of it. Across the room, the Drathian student sat alone with his tablets. The Velhari twins sat together, speaking quietly. The Zune occupied a corner of the room that I was fairly certain it had rearranged to suit itself. No one came to sit at my table. No one waved. No one was rude. They simply did not think about me. I looked at my food. I looked at the room full of brilliant, ancient, extraordinary people. I looked at the stars through the wide observation panel on the far wall. Thick, cold stars. Nothing like the sky above Accra. Nothing familiar at all. I thought about my grandmother. She used to say, in the particular way she had of saying things that sounded simple until you thought about them, "The most dangerous mistake you can make, Mira, is to confuse being underestimated with being defeated. They are not the same thing. One of them is someone else's error. The other one is yours." I finished my cardboard dinner. I went back to my room. I sat at the small desk under the photograph and opened my notebook, a real paper notebook, which I had brought from Earth because I think better on paper, and I wrote down everything I could remember about the Solhari treatise on crisis mathematics. Then I wrote down the parts of it that didn't quite add up. There were several. Not errors exactly, more like gaps, places where the theory assumed conditions that would never exist in a real emergency, places where the math was clean because the scenario was clean, and real emergencies are never clean. I circled those gaps. I numbered them. I wrote 3 questions in the margin next to each one. Then I turned off the desk light, lay down on the sleeping platform, and looked at the ceiling of my small room on a space station 400 light-years from home. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was something more precise than afraid. I was aware, fully, carefully, completely aware, that tomorrow, and every day after it, I would be sitting in rooms designed for minds that had been shaped by civilizations thousands of years older than mine. I would be working through problems built from frameworks my species had only just begun to understand. I would be, by every standard measure, the least experienced person in every room I entered. But experience and knowledge are not the same thing. And there were gaps in that Solhari treatise that nobody had circled yet. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow's class was at 7th hour. I set an alarm for 5th. I was going to be ready. I had not come 400 light years to sit quietly in the back row forever. I had not spent the last 3 years of my life studying crisis mathematics, systems engineering, and every piece of galactic academic literature I could find in Earth's translation databases just to be a decorative element in someone else's story. I had come here to learn, yes. But I had also come here because Director Tede had fought for 11 years to get one human being through that door, and the human being who walked through it was going to make that fight mean something. I thought about the gaps in the Solhari treatise. I thought about my numbered questions in the margins. I thought about the way Professor Keth Valos had let his gaze pause on me for 2 seconds before moving on. The way you pause at something unexpected, something that doesn't fit the room you thought you were walking into. I thought, he will pause again. And when he does, I will be ready for what comes after the pause. The station's lights dimmed around me, settling into the night cycle. Somewhere in the atmospheric processing units above the ceiling, machines that I would never see worked steadily through the dark, keeping the air breathable, keeping the pressure right, keeping everything running so that none of us inside had to think about what it cost to exist this far from any planet. The station had been doing this for 600 years. It did not advertise the effort. It simply continued. I understood that feeling completely. I lay on my back in the dark, and for one long, quiet moment, I let myself feel the full weight of where I was. Not the fear of it. I had already decided to set fear aside, as something I would deal with later, if at all. But the reality of it. The sheer, staggering, honest reality of a 19-year-old girl from Accra lying on a sleeping platform on a space station 400 light-years from home, looking at a ceiling she shared with 4,000 students from civilizations that had been reaching for the stars, while humanity was still drawing maps on the backs of animal skins. It was a lot. I will not pretend it wasn't. But my grandmother had circled gaps in things too. She had spent her career looking at reactor designs that everyone else had signed off on, turning them over in her hands, asking questions that people found inconvenient because the designs were already built and the money was already spent, and surely there was no need to keep pulling at the thread. Sometimes she was wrong. More often, she was right. And the times she was right, her questions had mattered enormously. She did not get famous for it. Her name is not in any history book I have ever read. But she saved lives, real and specific lives, through the discipline of circling what didn't add up and refusing to let it go. I had her eyes, my mother always said, and her handwriting, which was terrible, and, she added on good days, her mind. I hoped that last part was true. Because tomorrow I was going to walk back into that lecture hall, take my seat in the back row, and keep being exactly what I was, a student, a learner, someone with a lot still to understand. I was not going to arrive with anything to prove. I was not going to be louder than the room needed, or sharper than the moment called for. But I was going to keep circling the gaps. And I was going to be ready for the day when someone finally asked me what I had found inside them. The second week of classes was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others. Easier because I had stopped getting lost. I knew which corridors connected to which rings, which atmospheric transitions required me to adjust my breathing pace, and which food replication settings produced something that tasted at least adjacent to real food. The station had stopped feeling like a puzzle I was failing to solve, and started feeling more like a place I was learning to live in. That was progress, small progress, but I have always believed that small progress, compounded daily, is how most worthwhile things actually get done. Harder, because I was beginning to understand the true scale of what I didn't know. In my other 5 courses, I was managing. Physics was difficult, but the frameworks were recognizable. Earth's scientific tradition had built from the same foundational observations, even if the galactic extensions of those theories went far beyond anything I had studied at home. Comparative technological history was, if anything, fascinating, because it was full of examples of civilizations that had solved the same problems humanity was still wrestling with, and seeing the different paths they had taken was like reading several versions of the same story at once, all with different endings. Systems engineering and planetary ecology were challenging but not defeating. I kept up. I took careful notes. I asked questions when I didn't understand something. And I was slowly getting better at reading the tone of a Velhari professor who didn't emote the way humans do but whose meaning was usually clear if you paid close enough attention. Adaptive crisis mathematics was different. It was not that the subject was beyond me. I want to be precise about this, because there is a difference between something being difficult and something being designed for someone else. The course material itself, the equations, the modeling frameworks, the case study structures, was something I could follow, with effort, with extra reading, with late nights and a paper notebook full of margin notes. I was working harder than I had ever worked in my life, and it was paying off in the way that hard work usually does, slowly, and without ceremony. The problem was not the material. The problem was the room. In adaptive crisis mathematics, there were 12 students, as I have said, and in those 12 students there was a clear and unspoken arrangement, the kind that forms in any group of people without anyone deciding to form it. There were students who were at the center of the room's attention, the Velhari twins, Rael Vo the Drathian, and the Zuan, who had told me during our second class that I could call it Zuan 7, since it was the 7th collective representative its species had sent to the academy. These 4 were the students Professor Keth Velos talked to, questioned, challenged, and engaged. They were the students whose answers he built upon, whose mistakes he corrected with interest rather than indifference. The rest of us, 8 students of various species including me, existed at the room's edges. We were not excluded exactly. We were simply not included. There is a difference, and it matters. I had stopped expecting Keth Velos to call on me during general discussion. That was fine. I listened carefully, took my notes, and told myself that understanding the material was the point, not being seen to understand it. But I watched him, and I noticed things about how he ran his class that were worth noting. He was an exceptional teacher when he chose to engage. He could take a complex equation and unfold it like a piece of paper, showing every layer, every assumption, every place where a small change in input produced a dramatic change in output. He clearly loved this subject. You could see it in the way his silver eyes brightened when a student produced an answer that surprised him, and in the way he went very still, a particular quality of stillness, like a deep lake in still air, when someone said something that genuinely interested him. He had not gone still for anything I had said. But then again, I had not said much yet. I was waiting. I was not entirely sure what I was waiting for, but I had learned from watching my grandmother that timing matters enormously in any kind of engineering work. You do not intervene in a system until you understand what the system is doing. You observe first. You circle the gaps. Then, when you understand what you are looking at, you act. The moment I had been waiting for arrived on the 14th day of term, during the 3rd session of Adaptive Crisis Mathematics. It arrived in the form of a problem. Keth Velos had been building toward it for 2 weeks. He had been laying groundwork, the foundational math of cascade failure, the topology of interdependent systems, the difference between a failure that is contained and a failure that propagates. He had been teaching us, in careful sequence, how to read the shape of a disaster before it fully arrived. And now, on the 14th day, he stepped back from all of that groundwork and looked at the room with an expression I had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to do something deliberate. He cleared the holographic display above the platform with one gesture of his long fingers. The spinning equations dissolved. In their place, 4 interlocking diagrams appeared, 4 systems, each one complex enough to require its own dedicated analysis, and each one connected to the others in ways that multiplied the complexity by factors that made my stomach tighten slightly when I first looked at them. This, Keth Velos said in his 3-mouthed harmonic voice, is a real scenario, not a textbook version, not a simplified model. This is an actual event sequence, taken from a Drathian orbital station's incident records, anonymized for academic use, from approximately 200 years ago. The room was quiet. 12 students looking at 4 interlocked systems diagrams, each of us doing the rapid mental arithmetic of someone trying to understand the shape of a problem before being told what question to ask about it. The 4 systems were an energy distribution network, a thermal management framework, a structural pressure system, and an automated safety protocol grid. They were interdependent in a specific way. The energy system fed the thermal system, the thermal system's outputs fed back into the structural system, and the safety protocol grid was supposed to monitor all 3 and intervene when any one of them moved outside its operational parameters. In theory, the safety grid was the backstop. In practice, as the incident records made clear, the 4 systems had been installed by different contractors over a period of 60 years, and each contractor had made assumptions about the other systems that were not entirely accurate. The result was a structure that functioned perfectly under normal conditions and became dangerous in a very specific set of circumstances that no single contractor had designed for, because no single contractor had been looking at all 4 systems at once. The question, Keth Velos said, is not what happened. The incident records tell you what happened. The question is this: given the state of these 4 systems at the moment indicated, he highlighted a specific point in the timeline. What is the complete solution set? Not a patch. Not a workaround. The actual mathematical framework that resolves the cascade and stabilizes all 4 systems simultaneously. He looked at the room. This problem, he continued, requires a branch of applied topology that most of you will not formally study until your 2nd year. I am presenting it now because I want to see how you approach what you do not yet have the tools to solve. There was a shift in the room, not quite tension, but something close to it. The quality of air in a space where everyone is thinking very hard and not quite ready to speak. I have felt it in exam halls back home. It feels the same across species, it turns out. Railvo, the Drathian, spoke first. He was always the first to speak, which I had come to understand was partly confidence and partly the cultural expectation of his species that the most academically credentialed person in a room speaks before others. He cited a standard Drathian framework for cascade analysis, which was thorough and well-constructed, and addressed one of the four systems very well, but it did not touch the interaction between the thermal and structural systems, which was where the actual problem lived. One of the Velhari twins, I had begun to distinguish them by the small differences in the way they tilted their heads when thinking, offered a secondary approach that complemented Railvo's framework, but again stopped at the edge of the real difficulty. She knew she had stopped there. She said so, which I respected. Zun 7 offered something more interesting, a probabilistic model that estimated the behavior of the cascading failure without attempting to solve it directly, which was honest and creative but was not, ultimately, a solution. Keth Valos acknowledged it with a slow nod that meant he found it notable. No one solved it. No one was expected to, not completely. He had said as much. This was about approach, about showing your thinking, about the shape of how you move through a problem you cannot fully resolve. I had been writing since the moment the diagrams appeared. My notebook was open on my knee, the paper one, the one from home, and I had been sketching the interaction points between the four systems, mapping where each contractor's assumptions had diverged from reality, numbering the specific moments in the timeline where the cascade had become, as I noted in my margin, not a failure of any one system but a failure of the gaps between them. I had also been thinking about something else, something I had not planned to say, something that had arrived while I was reading the incident records and thinking about a very different set of records, from a very different part of human history, that described a remarkably similar structure of failure. My hand went up. I did not think about it first, which is unusual for me. I usually think before I do things. But my hand went up with a kind of quiet certainty that felt less like a decision and more like a conclusion, the kind that arrives after a long period of preparation, when all the thinking is done and what remains is simply to act. Keth Valos saw it. He paused, and in that pause I saw the same 2-second recalibration I had seen on the first day of class, the small flicker of encountering something unexpected. Then all four of his silver eyes settled on me with an expression that I could not quite read but that contained, I was almost certain, a layer of mild amusement. He had 12 students in his room. He knew the academic histories of 11 of them. The 12th was a 19-year-old human on a provisional scholarship from a planet that most of the galaxy had filed under recently spacefaring, monitor and revisit. He had not called on me in 2 weeks. He had, I suspected, not expected me to raise my hand during a problem at this level. He let the pause sit for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he said it. By all means, little Terran. His 3 mouths moved in their staggered sequence, and the words came out with a particular texture, polished, measured, and carrying beneath them a current of something that was not cruelty, but was certainly not kindness. Show us how your species approaches it. And then he smiled. All 3 mouths, in sequence, with 3 different expressions layered on top of each other. The top mouth curved with something that looked like curiosity. The middle mouth held a specific kind of patience, the patience of someone who has already decided what the outcome will be, and is simply waiting for it to arrive. The bottom mouth had the faintest trace of amusement, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it is confident enough to be quiet. It was, taken together, a very accomplished smile. The smile of someone who had been teaching for long enough that they had developed a finely calibrated expression for the moment when a student volunteers an answer the teacher has already decided will be wrong. I heard sounds around the room. Not laughter exactly, more like the alien equivalent of a politely suppressed reaction. A sound that said, "This will be brief and educational, and not for the human girl." I sat with that sound for exactly 3 seconds. I want to explain those 3 seconds, because they mattered. In those 3 seconds I felt the full weight of what had just happened. The smile, and the word little, and the phrase your species, and the current running beneath all of it that said, you are here because someone let you in, not because you belong. I felt it the way you feel a cold wind, entirely, physically, without the option of not feeling it. I did not try to pretend it wasn't happening. I did not tell myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was a very specific thing that had been done deliberately, with full awareness of what it communicated, by someone who was very good at communication. I let myself feel it. and then I put it away, in the specific internal place I have always kept for things that I will deal with later, and I stood up. I walked from my seat in the back row to the presentation board at the front of the room. Keth Valos watched me walk. The other students watched me walk. The room had the quality of a place where everyone is very still in a way that means they are paying complete attention. I picked up the notation stylus from the board's edge. It was calibrated for Solhari hand proportions, longer than I needed, slightly heavier, but manageable. I looked at the 4 systems diagrams for a moment. Then I began to write. Not with the Drathian framework, which was the expected starting point. Not with the Velhari probability matrices, which were the elegant starting point. I started somewhere else entirely, and I knew even as I started that it would look wrong to everyone in the room, at least at first. It would look like I didn't understand the standard approach. It would look like I was working from a different set of tools entirely, which was exactly correct. I drew a single horizontal line across the board. Above it, I wrote 4 words in Galactic Standard, what was designed for. Below the line, I wrote 4 more, what it was actually. Between those 2 lines, in the gap, I began to map the distance between assumption and reality, not for one system, but for all 4 at once, and specifically at the points where those distances intersected. This is not a 4-system failure, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which was a relief. It is a failure of the spaces between 4 systems, the energy distribution network, the thermal framework, the structural pressure system, and the safety grid all worked correctly, within their own parameters. They failed in the places where their designers had made assumptions about each other's work. I circled the 4 intersection points on the diagram. They formed, when connected, a shape that was not quite a square, more like a quadrilateral with unequal sides, which happens when 4 different contractors make 4 different sets of assumptions about 3 shared boundaries. In human engineering, I said, we call this a handoff problem. It happens when one team finishes their work and hands it to the next team, and something gets lost in the hand. I wrote the first equation. It was not the topology Keth Valos had mentioned. Not yet. That would come in a moment. For now it was something simpler and more fundamental, a measurement of the divergence between what each system was designed to receive and what it was actually receiving at the critical moment in the timeline. I could feel the room behind me. I did not turn around, but I could feel it, the particular quality of a silence that has changed its character. It had been, a few minutes ago, the silence of polite expectation. Now it was something different, something more attentive, something that was paying attention not because it was waiting for me to fail, but because it had noticed that what I was writing on the board was not what it had expected. I kept writing. The 4 divergence values, once calculated and placed side by side, revealed something. When you looked at them together, not independently, but as a system of interactions, they produced a pattern, a specific shape of compounding error. And that shape, I noted in my margin as I transferred the logic to the board, was one I recognized from somewhere that had nothing to do with the Galactic Academy, or Solhari mathematics, or anything on the course reading list. I recognized it from a set of incident reports from a power station in the southeastern United States, from 1979, from a debrief document written by a safety engineer in Kiev, from 1986, from a grid failure analysis conducted by an electrical authority in New York, from 2003, human engineering disasters, the kind my grandmother had spent her career studying, and teaching others to study, and eventually teaching others to prevent. The shape of the failure was the same. Different scale, different technology, different species, different century, the same shape. And we had, after enough of those disasters, developed a framework for addressing it. I turned slightly toward the room. Not fully. I kept one hand on the board, anchored to the work, but enough to let my voice carry clearly. My grandmother was a nuclear safety engineer, I said. She used to say that the most dangerous system is not the one that fails spectacularly. It is the one that fails in the seams. Because in the seams, nobody is watching. Everyone has agreed that the other person is responsible for the seam, and so the seam belongs to no one. I turned back to the board. The solution, I said, begins at the seams. And I kept writing. Behind me, the room was very quiet. I did not hear anyone laugh. I have been in rooms where the silence changes. It is a specific experience, and if you have felt it even once, you know what I mean. It is not the absence of sound. It is something more active than that. It is the sensation of a room holding its breath, of 12 different minds, shaped by 12 different kinds of biology and education and history, all arriving at the same moment of uncertainty at the same time. The silence I left behind me as I turned back to the board was that kind of silence. It had weight, it had texture, and it was paying attention. I kept writing. The first thing I needed to establish was the measurement framework. Before any solution can be built, you need to know what you are measuring. And in this particular problem, 4 interdependent systems failing at their shared edges, the standard galactic measurement approach had a structural problem. It measured each system independently, and then attempted to reconcile the measurements afterward. This was efficient and accurate when the systems were genuinely independent, when they were not, when they shared boundaries, when the output of one became the input of another in ways that compounded over time. Measuring them separately produced numbers that were individually correct and collectively misleading. I had seen this problem before. Not with orbital stations, not with systems this complex or this large, but the shape of it, the specific way that individually accurate measurements could combine into a collectively false picture, was something I had first encountered in a document my grandmother had left on the kitchen table when I was 14 years old. She had been working late, and the document was a post-incident analysis from a chemical processing facility in West Africa, and it had been opened to the page where the investigation team had finally found what went wrong. I had read it while waiting for her to come back from the garden. I had not understood all of it, but I had understood the central finding, which was written in plain language at the top of the page in a way that suggested whoever wrote it was very tired and had no patience left for technical softening. It said, "Each sensor was correct, the system was wrong." I had thought about that sentence many times since. I thought about it now as I wrote the new measurement framework on the board. Not the standard approach, but a modified version that measured the 4 systems as a single object, rather than 4 separate ones, tracking the interactions between them, rather than the behaviors within them. The standard approach, I said, keeping my voice level and informational, the way my grandmother used to when she was explaining something she had worked hard to understand and wanted to share without making it feel like a lecture, measures each system from its own center outward. This is precise. It tells you exactly what each system is doing, but it does not tell you what the systems are doing to each other. I drew 4 circles on the board, overlapping at their edges. The overlapping regions were where the 4 systems interacted, where the energy network handed off to the thermal framework, where the thermal outputs touched the structural pressure calculations, where the safety grid drew its monitoring data from all 3. These regions, I said, tapping the overlapping areas, are not in any system's primary data set. The energy network does not monitor them because they are at its edge. The thermal framework does not monitor them because they are at its edge. The structural system does not monitor them. The safety grid is supposed to monitor them, but the safety grid was designed 60 years after the other 3, by a team that received data from the other 3 systems, in a format that had been translated twice, once from the energy network's original language, and once from the thermal frameworks. And in both translations, a small rounding assumption was made that was documented internally, and then, over time, forgotten. I paused to write the rounding values on the board. They were small numbers. Individually, they were the kind of numbers that anyone looking at them in isolation would consider negligible, the mathematical equivalent of a few grains of sand. But when you applied them to a system running at scale, over time, with those small errors feeding forward from one system to the next, they grew. Not quickly, not in a way that triggered any single alarm. Slowly, quietly, in the seams where no one was watching, the error accumulated. This is what my grandmother called a patient problem, I said. Most engineering failures are loud. They announce themselves. Something breaks. An alarm sounds. People respond. Patient problems are different. They build quietly, in the background, for a long time. And by the time they become visible, they are already serious. I wrote the accumulated error values on the board, following them forward through the timeline of the incident. The numbers started small and stayed small for a long time. Then, at a specific moment in the timeline, the moment Keth Valos had highlighted at the start of the session, they crossed a threshold. Not one system's threshold. Not a threshold that any individual monitoring instrument was configured to detect. A combined threshold, the product of 4 small errors intersecting at the same point in the same moment, producing a composite failure that no single system had been designed to anticipate. This is the point, I said, circling the threshold moment on the timeline. Not because anything broke at this moment. Nothing broke at this moment. This is the point, because this is where the 4 patient errors became one acute problem. Everything that followed was a consequence of what was already present. I put the stylus down briefly and looked at what I had written. The board was full. Equations, diagrams, circled numbers, the timeline with its highlighted threshold. It was not beautiful in the way that galactic academic work tends to be beautiful. It was not elegant. It was dense and somewhat rough, the way something looks when it has been built for function rather than form. My grandmother's desk had always looked like this. My grandfather's flood maps had always looked like this. It was the aesthetic of people who were interested in whether something worked rather than whether it looked like it should. I picked up the stylus again. Now, I said, the solution. I heard a very small sound behind me. I am not sure which student made it, or whether it was intentional. It was the sound of someone sitting slightly more upright, of attention, already present, sharpening further. The solution, as I had worked it out in the 3 weeks since I first identified the gaps in the Solhari treatise, required 3 components. I had not known, when I first started circling those gaps, that I would be standing at a board in a Galactic Academy presenting them. I had been working it out for myself, the way I always work things out, because the question was interesting and I could not stop thinking about it, and because the discipline of following a question wherever it leads, regardless of whether anyone is watching, is something my grandmother had modeled so consistently throughout my childhood that I had absorbed it without noticing. The first component was the measurement correction I had already outlined, shifting from independent system monitoring to integrated boundary monitoring, so that the interaction zones between systems were tracked directly rather than inferred. This was the foundational step. Without it, the other 2 components could not function. This part, I told the room, exists in human engineering. We developed it after a series of failures in our early nuclear energy period. We call it interface auditing. The principle is that in any system where multiple teams have built interconnecting components, the interfaces between those components are treated as independent systems in their own right, with their own monitoring protocols, their own performance standards, and their own responsibility chains. Nobody is allowed to assume that the interface is someone else's responsibility. The interface belongs to everyone who touches it, which is another way of saying it belongs to a dedicated interface team whose only job is the seam. I wrote the words interface team on the board and underlined them. Then I moved to the second component. This was the part that I had been slightly nervous about presenting, not because I was uncertain of it, but because it required explaining something that did not exist in galactic academic literature under any name I had been able to find. I had searched the Academy's research database for 3 nights, using every combination of search terms I could construct. I had found related concepts, adjacent ideas, approaches that touched the edges of what I was describing, without ever arriving at it directly. The framework itself, as a named and documented methodology, appeared to exist only in human engineering literature, developed over roughly a century of industrial and nuclear safety work, refined through incident after incident, shaped by the particular discipline of a species that had been building complex systems without fully understanding them since the beginning of the industrial age. We had not developed it because we were clever. We had developed it because we had no choice. The second component, I said, is what we call graceful degradation design. I wrote the phrase on the board. Then I turned to face the room properly for the first time since I had started writing, because this part I needed to explain rather than demonstrate, and explanation requires eye contact, or its equivalent. Graceful degradation, I told them, was a design philosophy built on a specific and unflinching assumption that complex systems will fail, not might fail, will fail. It is a question of when and how, not whether. Human engineering history had made this lesson so thoroughly and so repeatedly that by the late 20th century it had become foundational principle rather than cautionary possibility. The question was no longer how to build systems that do not fail. The question was how to build systems that fail well. Failing well, I said, means something specific. It means that when a component reaches its limit, it does not take the whole structure down with it. It means that failure in one part of a system reduces the system's capacity, rather than destroying it entirely. It means that the system, as it degrades in a direction that preserves its most critical functions for as long as possible. I turned back to the board. Applied to this problem, I said, it means redesigning the interaction between the 4 systems so that when the thermal framework exceeds its parameters, as it did, at the moment we identified, it does not immediately overload the structural pressure system. Instead, it signals, it slows, it transfers a reduced load, and it holds a degraded but functional state while the safety grid responds. The cascade does not stop. Cascades, once initiated, do not simply stop. But a cascade in a gracefully degraded system is a manageable cascade. It moves slower. It gives operators time. I wrote the mathematical framework for this on the board. It was the part that used the applied topology Keth Velos had mentioned, the branch of mathematics that the second-year curriculum would formally cover, which I had taught myself over 2 weeks from a Solhari reference text and a human engineering safety manual, working out the translation between the 2 frameworks in the margins of my paper notebook. It was not perfect. My version of the topology had rough edges and places where I had made assumptions that a more rigorous treatment would refine, but it was functional. It described the correct shape of the solution even where it did not yet have all the precise details. I built it on the board slowly, talking through each step, because this was the part that required the most careful explanation, and I was aware that I was presenting mathematics in a form that the room had not seen before, not because it was beyond them, but because it came from a direction they had not been looking. The room was completely still, not the polite stillness of the early session, when the students had been watching a human girl walk to the front board with the contained expectation of a brief and educational correction. This was a different quality of stillness. I have tried to find the right word for it, and the closest I can come is focused. The room was focused. 12 minds, each shaped differently, each carrying different sets of tools and traditions and frameworks, all of them engaged with what was on the board in front of them in a way that was not polite and was not social and had nothing to do with me as a person. They were engaged with the problem. They were following the logic, and the logic, rough as my version of it was leading somewhere that they recognized as real. I got to the third component. This one was the simplest to explain and the most human in origin, which made it both the easiest and, I suspected, the most surprising. The third component, I said, is documentation. I felt, rather than heard, a slight shift in the room. Documentation was not, by any standard, a dramatic mathematical concept. It was not topology or interface auditing. It was paperwork. The word itself sounds almost embarrassingly mundane next to the complexity of what had preceded it, but I meant it. The Drathian Orbital Station's incident records show that the rounding assumption in the safety grid's data translation was documented internally at the time it was made, 60 years before the incident. It was written down. Someone knew about it and recorded it. And then it was lost, not destroyed, not hidden, simply lost, the way things get lost in large organizations over long periods of time, buried under layers of subsequent documentation, filed in a system that evolved over 60 years and did not maintain consistent cross-referencing standards. I paused. Human organizations have made this mistake so many times that we eventually built an entire field around preventing it. We call it safety documentation management. Its premise is simple. A known problem that is not findable is functionally identical to an unknown problem. Information that exists but cannot be retrieved does not exist where it matters. I wrote the principle on the board. It sat there at the bottom of a long column of equations and diagrams, 6 plain words among all the mathematics. Known problems must remain findable. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at the 4 systems diagrams, still rotating slowly in the holographic display above the platform, and the incident timeline with its highlighted threshold, and the full framework I had built across the board in the last. I checked the station's time display on the wall. 22 minutes. 22 minutes. It felt both longer and shorter than that. I set the stylus down on the board's edge. I straightened the paper notebook I had been holding in my left hand throughout, the one with the margin notes from 3 weeks of late evenings. I turned to face the room. Keth Valos was standing exactly where he had been standing when I walked to the front of the class. He had not moved. His 4 silver eyes were on the board, not on me, which meant he was still reading, still working through what I had written, following the logic, checking the steps. His 3 mouths were all in the same expression, which was unusual. Normally they held slightly different shapes. Now they all held the same one. I did not immediately know what the expression meant. I knew what it was not. It was not amusement, and it was not the patient, waiting expression he had worn when he invited me to speak. It was not dismissal. I looked at the rest of the room. Rael Vo, the Drathian, had stopped taking notes at some point during the graceful degradation section. His stylus was resting on the bench beside him, and he was looking at the board with an expression I recognized across species without difficulty. It is the expression a person wears when they have encountered an idea they had not considered before and are already working out its implications. It is partly concentration and partly a particular kind of alertness, the look of a mind that has just found a new thread and is already following it. The Velhari twin on the left, the one who had asked the sharper questions during the course's first 2 weeks, had her head tilted at an angle I had not seen from her before. Her wide dark eyes were moving across the board in a way that suggested she was reading it the same way she might read a research paper, systematically, evaluating each section in relation to the ones before it. Zune 7 was completely still. This was notable because the Zune are not, by nature, completely still. They shift and adjust continuously, redistributing their collective mass in small, constant movements. Zune 7's absolute stillness was the most focused form of attention its species expressed. Nobody was speaking. And then I noticed something that I had not expected, and that I found, when I noticed it, more meaningful than any of the equations I had written on the board. Somewhere during the third component, during the explanation of safety documentation management and the principle of known problems remaining findable, the Drathian noble had opened a private data link on the device clipped to his left wrist. I could see its faint glow from where I was standing. He was copying something. He was being very precise about it, moving his finger across the display in careful, deliberate increments. He was copying my work. Rael Vo, whose family's academic tradition stretched back further than most human civilizations, whose blue-bordered robe marked him as one of the most credentialed students in the room, was copying the notes of a 19-year-old girl from Accra who had arrived at this station 3 weeks ago with one bag and a wrinkled letter of admission. I looked at the board. I looked at my grandmother's framework, translated into Galactic Standard, written in my untidy handwriting across the most prestigious academic surface I had ever stood in front of. I looked at Rael Vo's quietly glowing data link. I thought, she would have found this very funny. And then I thought, she would also have found it completely right. I turned back to the board one more time and said the last thing I had to say. This is not the complete solution. I want to be precise about that. The topology I have used in the second component needs a more rigorous treatment than I have given it here, and the interface auditing framework I have described would need significant adaptation for systems of this scale and age. What I have given you is the shape of the solution. The full mathematical body of it would take considerably longer to develop. I picked up the stylus one more time and drew a single line beneath everything I had written. Not a dividing line, but a connecting one, running from the measurement correction through the graceful degradation framework to the documentation principle, linking all three into one continuous thought. The three components work together, I said. None of them is sufficient alone. Measuring the seams correctly does not help if the system is not designed to degrade in an ordered way. Designing for graceful degradation does not help if the known problems in the system are not findable. And finding the known problems does not help if you do not have a framework to measure whether they have been resolved. I looked at the line on the board. They are one solution, I said, in 3 parts. I set the stylus down. I walked back to my seat in the back row. I sat down. I put my notebook on my knee. I held the pen in my right hand, ready to keep taking notes, because the class was not over and there was almost certainly more to be said, and I intended to write all of it down. Professor Keth Valos had still not moved. His 3 mouths were still holding that same expression, the one I had not been able to name when I first noticed it. Now, looking at him from my seat in the back row, the distance between us and the angle of the light gave me a slightly better view of his face, and I looked at it carefully, the way I look at anything I am trying to understand properly. And I realized, with a quiet feeling that I would spend a long time thinking about later, that the expression on all 3 of his mouths was the same. It was the expression of someone who had just circled a gap and found something inside it. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows something unexpected. It is different from the quiet that precedes it. Before an unexpected thing happens, quiet is simply the absence of noise, comfortable, neutral, unremarkable. After an unexpected thing happens, quiet becomes something you are aware of. It has edges. It takes up space in a room the way a new piece of furniture does, and everyone in the room adjusts their posture slightly to account for it, even if they do not notice they are doing so. That was the quiet in Lecture Hall 7 at the moment I sat back down in my seat. I put my pen to my notebook and waited. I expected Keth Valos to speak. He was the teacher. This was his class, his problem, his timeline. It was his role to take what had been presented and do something with it, correct it, extend it, compare it to the established frameworks, situate it within the broader course structure. That was how it had worked in every session prior. A student answered, and then the professor responded, and the class moved forward. That was the rhythm. He did not follow the rhythm. He stood on the platform with his 4 silver eyes on the board, and he was still in that way I had noticed at the very beginning of the course, the particular quality of stillness he reserved for things that genuinely interested him. The deep lake stillness, the stillness of a mind that is working very hard on the inside while the body does nothing on the outside. The seconds passed. I counted 7 of them. Then he spoke. Miss Osei. His 3 mouths moved in their staggered sequence. My name, in his voice, sounded like 3 slightly different pronunciations of the same word layered on top of each other, which was strange but not unpleasant. You have identified the shape of a solution. You said as much yourself. Yes, I said. What you have not addressed, he continued, still looking at the board rather than at me, is what happens after. I held my pen. After the solution is implemented, after the solution succeeds, He turned then, and all 4 of his eyes came to me. You have resolved the cascade. The 4 systems are stabilized. The threshold has been crossed in the correct direction. The station is operational. He paused. What happens in 40 hours? The room stirred. I noticed it peripherally. The twins exchanging a glance. Railvo's stylus lifting from his data link. I understood the question immediately. I had thought about it. I had thought about it at length, which was why, in my notebook, there were 6 pages of margin notes that I had not transferred to the board because I had not expected to need them. They were the pages I had written after I finished the solution, the pages that began with the words, "But what comes next?" I opened my notebook to those pages. The 3 accepted textbook solutions to this scenario, I said, and I kept my voice careful and level, because I was about to say something that would either be received as genuinely useful or as a student overstepping, and I was not entirely sure which it would be. All produce secondary failure conditions within 40 hours of stabilization. The quality of the room's attention shifted again. I was becoming familiar with the way this particular group of minds responded to new information. There was a collective sharpening, like 12 separate instruments tuning to the same note at slightly different moments. Keth Velos had not moved. Explain. I flipped to the relevant page in my notebook and then looked at the board, measuring the available space. There was a small section at the lower right that I had not used. I stood up, walked back to the front of the room, and I want to note that this second walk to the board felt entirely different from the first. The first walk had been made against the current of a room that expected me to fail. This one was made in a room that was simply waiting to see what came next. The difference is not small. I picked up the stylus. The 3 textbook solutions all share a common assumption, I said. They assume that once the cascade is resolved and the 4 systems are stabilized, the interaction zones return to their pre-incident state. I drew a simple before and after diagram, 2 sets of 4 overlapping circles. In both diagrams, the overlapping regions look identical. Same size, same position, same relationship to the systems around them. I circled the overlapping regions in the after diagram. They are not identical. I wrote 3 numbers beside the after diagram. They were the residual stress values that remained in the interaction zones after a rapid cascade resolution, the mathematical equivalent of the way a metal bar that has been bent back into shape still holds, in its internal structure, the memory of having been bent. The bar looks straight. If you measure it from the outside, it is straight, but inside, at the level of its molecular structure, it has changed, and if you bend it again, it will not behave the same way it behaved before. It will fail differently, and it will fail sooner. The 3 textbook solutions resolve the visible cascade, I said. They restore all 4 systems to their operational parameters. By every external measurement, the station is safe, and it is safe, for a period. But the interaction zones have been subjected to stress during the cascade event, the accumulated error that built up over decades, and then discharged rapidly at the threshold moment, does not simply disappear when the systems stabilize, it redistributes. I drew the redistribution diagram. It was the most complex drawing I had put on the board, and I was aware that my rendering of it was rough, the kind of rough that a student produces when they are working from understanding rather than from preparation. But it was accurate in its structure, and accuracy in structure was what mattered. The redistributed stress settles into the interaction zones in a new pattern, I said. Different from the original pattern built slowly, over 60 years, and crossed the failure threshold at a specific point, under specific conditions. The new pattern, the post-resolution pattern, is less stable than the original. It has a lower failure threshold, and it crosses that lower threshold under conditions that are significantly less specific. I looked at the board. I looked at the numbers. Within 40 hours of a standard textbook resolution, the probability of a secondary cascade event reaches approximately 63%, I said. The secondary event is not identical to the primary. It is faster. It has fewer warning signs. And it affects the interaction zones in a way that makes a third event more likely than a second event was after the first. Silence. Not the attentive silence of earlier, which had been the silence of a room following an argument carefully. This was something new. This was the silence of a room that has just encountered a number it was not expecting, and is now holding that number very carefully, turning it over, checking it against what it already knows. 63% is not an abstract figure. It is not a theoretical possibility tucked safely in a margin of error. It is more likely than not. It means that a station that appeared to be saved had, under the standard resolution approach, a greater than even chance of entering a second, more dangerous failure cycle within 2 days. Railvo's stylus had stopped moving. His data link was still active. He was staring at the board. "Where?" said Keth Velos, and his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. and all three mouths were making the same sound in almost perfect unison, which I would later learn was something Solhari did when they were concentrating with unusual intensity. Did you derive that probability? From the residual stress calculations, I said, combined with a failure threshold model derived from human post-incident analysis literature, specifically from the work done by an International Safety Commission after a series of grid failures in Earth's early 21st century. They modeled secondary failure probabilities in systems that had undergone rapid resolution events without full interaction zone analysis. The numbers are consistent across case types. I wrote the citation on the board, the human equivalent of 1, a date and a source description, translated into Galactic Standard. It looked very small next to all the mathematics, but it was there. It was a real document, written by real engineers who had sat in real rooms after real disasters and asked the same question Keth Valos had just asked me: what happens after? The standard textbook solutions, I continued, were not designed incorrectly. I want to be clear about that. They were designed for the primary cascade event, and they address it correctly. The problem is that they treat the solution as an endpoint. They do not model what the act of solving creates. They do not account for the fact that resolving a cascade rapidly, without first remapping the interaction zones, changes the structure of those zones in a way that the system was not designed to handle. I drew the corrected resolution pathway beside the textbook one. It was longer. It had more steps. It required the operator to pause at an intermediate stabilization point, a partial resolution, holding the cascade at a managed level rather than eliminating it immediately, while the interaction zones were remapped and the residual stress was calculated and redistributed deliberately, rather than left to settle on its own. The corrected approach is slower, I acknowledged. In a real-time emergency, slower is not obviously desirable, but the mathematics suggest that a 20% slower resolution that eliminates the secondary failure probability is significantly better than a faster resolution that leaves a 63% chance of a worse event. I paused. My grandfather used to say that the most expensive thing in engineering is the shortcut that almost works. I had not planned to say that. It arrived the way some of the truest things do, without asking permission, already present before you notice it. My grandfather had said it about flood systems, about the particular human tendency to build something that was 90% of the way to right, because the last 10% was difficult and the deadline was close. He had said it without bitterness, the way he said most things, as an observation, a data point, something to be noted and remembered. I heard a sound in the room, a very small sound, from the direction of the Velhari twins. Not laughter, something quieter, the sound of a recognition, the sound that a person makes, across species, when they hear something stated simply that they have understood for a long time, but never had phrased for them quite that clearly. I looked at the board one final time, at the full picture of it, the original framework, the three components, the secondary failure analysis, the corrected resolution pathway. It covered nearly the entire surface. It was, I thought, the most complete piece of thinking I had ever done in front of other people. Not the deepest, not the most mathematically sophisticated, not the work of someone who had been studying crisis mathematics for decades, but complete, in the way that a thing is complete when it follows every thread it started and ties each one off honestly. I set the stylus down for the second time. I did not go back to my seat immediately. I stood at the edge of the platform and I looked at the room properly, perhaps for the first time since I had walked to the front of it, not the focused inward looking of someone working through a problem, but the wider looking of someone who has finished working and is now present in the space around them. Keth Valos was watching me, all four eyes, steady and silver and holding an expression that I still could not fully name but that had shifted from its earlier form into something more open, something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, across the considerable barrier of biology and species and the fact that I had only known this individual for 3 weeks, like genuine attention, the kind you give something that has earned it. Railvo had set his data link down on the bench. He was looking at the board, and then at me, and then at the board again, with the expression of someone who is reorganizing something internal, something that had been arranged in a certain way for a long time and was now being rearranged. The Velhari twin on the left, the sharper one, the one who asked the precise questions, had her head at that unfamiliar angle again. Her wide dark eyes were on me, not on the board, on me. I had the impression she was thinking about something that had nothing to do with cascade mathematics, and everything to do with a question that had occurred to her while listening. Zune 7 was still completely motionless, and then something happened that I had not anticipated at all. The Velhari twin spoke. "Your corrected resolution pathway," she said. Her voice was cool and precise, the voice of someone who thinks clearly and chooses words carefully. You described it as requiring a pause at an intermediate stabilization point, while the interaction zones are remapped. She tilted her head a fraction further. How long does the remapping take? I blinked. Not with surprise exactly, more with the adjustment of someone who has been speaking for a long time, and is now being asked to converse. At the scale of this system, approximately 4 hours. At larger scales, it depends on the complexity of the interaction network and the number of interface zones. She nodded slowly, the Velhari equivalent of writing something down. The Velhari home system, she said, carefully, has a deep space relay network currently operating with 612 interface zones between its primary components. The network is 240 years old. It was built in stages by 7 different construction authorities. She paused. No one has ever performed an interaction zone audit of the full network. The room was very still. I understood what she was saying, not as a theoretical problem, as a real one, as a system, 240 years old, built by 7 separate teams, with 612 seams that no one had ever looked at directly. I understood it the way I understood the Drathian orbital station incident the moment the 4 system diagrams appeared on the board. Immediately. With a particular cold clarity that comes when you recognize a shape you have seen before in a new context. That, I said carefully, would be worth looking at. She held my gaze for a moment. Her expression did not change. Velhari faces do not move the way human faces move. But her eyes, dark and wide, held something that I think was the equivalent of a nod, an acknowledgement, a quiet, serious one. I sat down. Keth Valos finally moved. He turned from the board to face the room, and he brought the holographic display back up with a gesture. The original 4-system diagram, now sitting alongside what I had written, the 2 things visible at the same time for comparison. He looked at them both for a long moment. Then he said in his full harmonic voice, addressing the whole room, Miss Osei has raised 3 points that are not in your course materials. The first is the interface auditing framework. The second is the graceful degradation design methodology. The third is the secondary failure probability model for rapid cascade resolution. He let that sit. None of these 3 concepts exist in galactic academic literature under these names or in this form. He paused again. I have reviewed the literature. The Academy's research database contains adjacent concepts. It does not contain these. He looked at the board. He looked at it the way you look at something you are deciding what to do with. Miss Osei, he said, where precisely did these frameworks originate? And I said what was true. From the engineering safety literature of Earth's industrial period, I said, roughly from 1950 to 2080, primarily from post-incident analyses produced after large-scale system failures in nuclear energy, grid infrastructure, and chemical processing. The frameworks were not invented by any single person. They developed incrementally, across several decades, through the work of safety engineers and incident investigators on every inhabited continent. Most of them have no individual author. They are, as a body of knowledge, the product of what happens when a civilization makes enough mistakes in enough different contexts, and pays close enough attention to what went wrong. I paused, and then I said the thing I had been thinking since I first walked to the board. We did not develop these frameworks because we are brilliant, I said. I want to be honest about that. We developed them because we had to. Because we were building complex systems before we fully understood them, and the systems failed, and people were hurt, and we looked very carefully at why, and we kept looking, across generations, until the looking became a discipline, and the discipline became a practice, and the practice became something we passed down. I looked at the board, at my grandmother's thinking, translated and written in a language she never learned, on a station she never knew existed. The galaxy's greatest civilizations, I said, learned to build things that work. Humanity learned to build things that fail well. I am not certain which lesson is more useful at the edge of what anyone knows. The room was quiet. The long, full, complete quiet of 12 minds, sitting with something they had not expected to find in this room on this day. Keth Valos turned from the board to me, and then he did something that I had not seen him do once in 3 weeks of classes. He did not ask a question. He did not offer a correction. He did not extend the problem or redirect the discussion or move the class forward. He simply looked at me, all 4 eyes, still and silver and open. And nobody in the room said a single word. Not Rael Vo, whose data link had long since gone dark. Not the Velhari twin, who was no longer looking at the board. Not Zune 7, still motionless in its circular seat. Not me. We sat in the fullness of what had just happened, 12 minds in a room designed for 300, and the board behind me covered in the handwriting of a 19-year-old girl from Accra and the decades-old thinking of a woman who had spent her career circling the gaps that everyone else had agreed to forget. And nobody, not a single person in that room, was smiling. There was nothing to smile about, not because anything was wrong, but because what was in that room at that moment was too serious and too real and too important for smiling. It had crossed into the territory of things that matter. And things that matter, when you are paying honest attention to them, do not make you smile. They make you lean forward. They make you reach for your notebook. They make you think about every system you have ever trusted and wonder, with a new and careful kind of alertness, how many seams it contains and whether anyone is watching them. That is the thing my grandmother always said was the most important outcome of good safety work, not the solution, not the framework, not the incident report or the policy change or the new design standard. The alertness. The moment when a person stops assuming that a working system is a safe system and starts asking the quieter, harder question underneath. Safe for how long, and in which seams, and what happens when those seams are no longer new. That question was in the room now. All 12 of us were holding it. I looked at my notebook, at the 6 pages of margin notes I had just transferred, roughly and honestly, to the most important board I had ever written on. I turned to a fresh page. I was not done yet. Class ended without ceremony. Kethvalos dismissed us with a gesture, a slow, deliberate movement of his long fingers that drew the holographic display closed and signaled, without words, that the session was over. He did not offer a summary. He did not assign additional reading. He did not do any of the things he had done at the end of every previous class. He simply closed the display and stood on the platform while the students gathered their things, and his 4 silver eyes stayed on the board the entire time, and I had the impression that he intended to remain there long after we had left. I gathered my own things slowly, my notebook, my 2 reference texts, the small carry case with my writing tools. I moved without hurrying because I was tired, in the specific way that comes not from physical effort, but from mental effort, that has been sustained at a high level for a long time. The kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and makes the lights in a room feel slightly brighter than they actually are. I was nearly at the door when the first person stopped me. I say the first person because there were, in total, 3. The first was not who I expected. Rael Vo stepped into my path near the exit, not blocking it, not confrontational, but deliberately placed. He was taller than me by nearly a full foot, and his deep blue robe with its silver border was very formal, and very straight, and very much the garment of someone who had been taught from early childhood that presentation matters. He held his data tablets under one arm. He looked at me with the slightly too still expression that I had come to understand was the Drathian version of uncertain. They are a species that does not wear uncertainty easily, and when it arrives, it tends to make their faces go very controlled rather than very open. "Miss Ose," he said. His galactic standard was precise and careful, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone speaking in a language that is not their first but that they have studied very hard. "I copied a portion of your work during the session. I want you to know that I did so." I looked at him. I noticed. Something moved across his face, not quite embarrassment but adjacent to it. Something in the family of unexpected situations that a person is not fully equipped to process. "It is not standard practice," he said, "copying another student's work without asking. In Drathian academic culture, it is considered," he paused, "it is considered an acknowledgement of something worth keeping." I thought about that for a moment. In human academic culture, copying another student's work without asking is considered something rather different. But I was not in human academic culture, and I was beginning to understand that the same action can carry entirely different meanings depending on who is performing it and where they come from. Rael Vo had not been cheating. He had been paying a particular kind of compliment that his culture had developed for precisely this situation. The situation of encountering something in a classroom that you recognize, immediately and without question, as worth preserving. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "You could have not told me." "Yes," he said, "but that would have been less honest." He shifted his tablets from one arm to the other. "The secondary failure probability model, the calculation you use to derive the 63% figure. I want to understand it more fully. The source you cited, the Human Safety Commission analysis from your early 21st century, is it accessible through the Academy's research database?" "It would be in the Human Literature Archive," I said. "Under Earth Historical Technical Literature, approximately the section covering 2001 to 2050. The translation quality varies. Some of the earlier documents were machine translated and have terminology inconsistencies. I can mark the relevant texts if that would help." He looked at me for a moment with his very controlled, very straight expression, and then he said, "That would be useful. Thank you." And then he gave a small, precise bow, the Drathian formal acknowledgement, which I had read about but never received, and walked out of the lecture hall. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. I had not expected that. I had expected, at most, a nod, a passing recognition, the kind of brief professional acknowledgement that people offer when something has been done well in a room they share and they feel it would be impolite to ignore entirely. What I had not expected was genuine engagement, the specific interest of a serious academic who had encountered something he wanted to understand more fully and was honest about wanting it. I went into the corridor. The second person was waiting a few meters from the door. Not exactly waiting. The Zuun do not wait the way humans wait, with visible impatience or visible patience. They exist, steadily, in a location, and either engage or do not engage when the relevant person passes. Zuun 7 was existing steadily near the corridor wall when I came out, and when I walked past, one of its surface eyes rotated toward me, and then a secondary cluster of smaller eyes followed, which I had learned was the Zuun equivalent of turning to face someone. "Mira Osei," it said. The Zuun's voice was not a single voice. It was many voices speaking in close overlap, almost synchronized but not quite, which produced a sound like a chorus with one dominant thread. It was unusual and not unpleasant once you were accustomed to it. I had grown accustomed to it by the second week of class. "Zuun 7, I said. "The framework you described for graceful degradation design," it said. "We have discussed it among ourselves." When the Zuun said among ourselves, it meant internally, within the collective, among the many minds that composed its singular identity. We do not find an equivalent in our species engineering literature. We find concepts that approach it from one direction or another, but not the complete framework as you described it. "It developed over a long time," I said, "and not in any single place. Different parts of it came from different engineering traditions on Earth, in different countries, in different industries. It is not a single invention. It is more like," I thought for a moment, "it is more like a river. Many tributaries, each one coming from somewhere different, eventually joining into one current." Zuun 7's secondary eye cluster held very still. This was, I had come to understand, the Zuun expression for paying close attention. "The tributaries," it said, "are they documented separately, by origin?" "Some are," I said. "The nuclear safety tradition is well documented. The aviation safety tradition is extremely well documented. The aviation industry on Earth developed very thorough post-incident analysis protocols relatively early, and those protocols influenced other industries significantly. The chemical processing tradition is patchier. Some of the early documents are incomplete because the industry was less regulated and less consistent about recording what went wrong. We would like to study the documented tributaries," Zuun 7 said, "collectively, as a research interest, separate from the course material." Its voice cluster shifted slightly, a modulation I had not heard before, which I could not immediately interpret. "We believe there may be applications to Zuun infrastructure that have not been considered. Our infrastructure is old. Much of it was designed by earlier iterations of our collective. The current collective does not have full access to the design reasoning of earlier iterations." I went very still inside, even though I kept my expression and posture neutral. What Zuun 7 had just said was, in engineering terms, significant. An infrastructure designed by minds that the current operators could not fully access was, structurally, very close to the Drathian orbital station scenario. 4 systems built by teams that could not see each other's reasoning. The mechanisms were different. The shape of the risk was the same. "That," I said carefully, "is worth taking seriously." "We are taking it seriously," Zuun 7 said, with the composed certainty of a mind, or rather, many minds, that do not say things they do not mean. "We may wish to speak with you further about it, with your permission, not immediately, after we have reviewed the source materials." "With my permission," I said, "yes." Zuun 7's eye cluster rotated slowly back to its default orientation, which was the Zuun equivalent of a nod. Then it moved away down the corridor in its steady, flowing way, and I watched it go the same way I had watched Rail Vo go, with the particular sensation of someone who has just had an experience they did not plan for, and is still in the process of understanding what it means. I turned and walked. The third person found me not in the corridor outside the lecture hall, but in the quieter corridor on the residential ring, 20 minutes later. I had been walking slowly, which is something I do when I need to think, and the residential corridors at that hour were largely empty, lit in their warm cycling pulse, quiet enough that you could hear the very distant background hum of the station's atmospheric systems, that steady, invisible work that kept everything inside breathable. I heard footsteps behind me, Not the footsteps of a Drathian, which had a specific, measured rhythm, or the near-silent movement of a Velhari. These were footsteps with a slight hesitation in them, the footsteps of someone who was not entirely sure they should be following me. I slowed and turned. The Velhari twin stood 3 meters behind me in the corridor, the one with the sharp questions and the unfamiliar head tilt. She had stopped when I turned, as if caught at something, and she stood very straight in the way her species tends to stand, spine perfectly aligned, head level, everything deliberate. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she had come here without fully deciding to. I waited. "I did not introduce myself at the beginning of term," she said. Her voice was cool and even, the careful English of someone who had learned it from academic materials rather than conversation. "My name is Velavara. My twin is Velaveni." She paused. "We do not always introduce ourselves separately." "Mira Ose," I said. "I know," she said. "Your name is in the course manifest." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I walked away from you in the corridor on your first day. You asked me for directions." I had not expected her to reference that. I looked at her carefully. "I remember," I said. "I did not respond," she said. "I want to be accurate about what happened. I did not deliberately refuse to help you. I did not know how to read you." She said it plainly, without apology but also without dismissal, in the same register she used for everything, factual and direct. "Your species is not one that I had significant experience with. Your appearance and your manner of moving and the specific inflection of your voice were outside my established reference patterns. I defaulted to non-engagement because I did not know how to engage. I understand that from your perspective that would have appeared as a deliberate slight." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me with her wide dark eyes, steady and serious, and I had the impression that this explanation had cost her something. Not pride exactly, but the comfort of not having to address something she had filed away as small and finished. "It appeared as someone who didn't want to speak to me," I said, "which is different from a deliberate slight, but it produced the same result in the moment." "Yes," she said, "I understand that." A brief pause. "I am telling you this because I would prefer that it not continue to produce that result." This was, I realized, an apology. Not structured like a human apology. No, I'm sorry. No direct acknowledgement of having caused harm. But in the Velhari framework, as I understood it from my preparatory reading, to explain an error precisely, and to express a preference that it not continue, was the complete form of an apology. It contained both the acknowledgement and the intention. It did not perform feeling. It stated fact and intent, which in Velhari terms was more honest than performing feeling would be. "I appreciate that," I said, and I meant it. She tilted her head at the angle I had come to associate with her thinking. "Your relay network question, the one you raised with me after class." "You raised it," I said. I agreed it was worth looking at. "Yes." Another pause, longer. "My family has ties to the Velhari Relay Network Authority. Not administrative ties. Engineering ties. My mother is a senior systems analyst. She has been concerned about the network's age for several years. She has not had a framework for articulating the specific nature of the risk in terms that the administrative authority can act on." She looked at me with complete steadiness. "Your framework for interface auditing provides that articulation." The corridor was very quiet. The station's hum was soft and continuous around us. "Velavara," I said, gently but clearly. "I am a first-year student on a provisional scholarship. I presented an unfinished framework in a class discussion. The framework needs rigorous mathematical development before it is ready for professional application." "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to present it to the Relay Network Authority tomorrow. I am telling you that what you said in that room today has an application that reaches beyond the room." She held my gaze. "I thought you should know that." I stood in the corridor and I held that information carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you have just been handed. Not tightly, just steadily, paying attention to its weight. "Thank you," I said. "That means something." She gave a small single nod. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, straight-spined and measured, and the corridor was quiet again. I stood there for a while after she had gone. I was tired, more tired than I had felt at any point in the 3 weeks since I arrived on Vorith Station, which was notable because those 3 weeks had contained some very long days. But this tiredness was different from exhaustion. It was the tiredness that comes after something real has happened, after you have been fully present in a significant moment, and spent everything you had in it, and the moment is over, and what remains is you, in a corridor, in a quiet station, 400 light-years from home. I leaned against the corridor wall. The wall was slightly warm, which I had noticed before. The station maintained a core temperature slightly above what the ambient air suggested, which I suspected was related to the ancient atmospheric systems my brain had filed under things I don't need to understand right now. I thought about the 3 conversations. Railvo, who had copied my work and told me so, and wanted to understand the source material more fully. Zuan7, who was taking the framework seriously as a research interest, and already thinking about applications to its own species infrastructure. Velavara, who had walked away from me without a word on my first day on the station, and had come to find me in a quiet corridor 21 days later, to tell me that her mother needed something I might be able to provide. 3 conversations I had not planned for. 3 people who had, in the hours since the class ended, moved from the category of distant classmates into something less distant. Not friends, not yet, and possibly not ever. The distances between our species, our histories, our ways of understanding the world were real and not easily crossed, but something less distant than they had been. I thought about that for a while. And then I thought about how tired I was, and then I looked at the stars through the small observation window at the end of the corridor. Cold, thick, plentiful, nothing like home. And I took my communication device from my pocket, and I sat down on the floor of the corridor, which is not something students are supposed to do, and I called my mother. It took 11 seconds to connect. 400 light years, routed through 3 relay nodes, and it took 11 seconds. I have always found that remarkable. 11 seconds to speak to someone on a planet I cannot see from here. She answered on the 3rd tone. Her face appeared in the small screen of my communication device, warm brown, familiar, her kitchen in the background with its yellow walls and the window that looks out onto the garden where she grows peppers and tomatoes and the particular variety of sweet basil that my grandmother had planted 20 years ago, and that my mother tends as carefully as a document she is responsible for preserving. Mira, she said, in the voice she uses when she is trying not to look relieved. She always looks relieved when I call. She has never told me she is worried, but she is always relieved. Hi, Mom, I said. She looked at me for a moment. My mother has always been able to read my face, which I have always found slightly inconvenient and enormously comforting. She looked at me with the particular attention of a person who knows someone's face very well, and can tell in 3 seconds what kind of day they have had. Tell me, she said. And so I told her, not all of it, not the mathematics, not the cascade failure analysis, not the secondary probability model, or the graceful degradation framework, or the Velhari relay network. She is not an engineer. She is a secondary school teacher, and she has always understood people better than she has understood systems, which may be why she and my grandmother, who understood systems better than she understood people, balanced each other so well for so many years. I told her the shape of it. I told her that I had been in a room today, and I had stood at the front of it, and I had said things that needed to be said, and the room had listened. I told her that I had thought about Grandma the whole time. I told her that it had been hard, and it had been worth it, and I was very tired. My mother listened. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions until I had finished, which is a skill I have always respected in her, and tried to learn from. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She would have been so proud of you." 3 words that I had not known, until she said them, were exactly what I needed to hear. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I sat on the floor of a corridor on Vorith Station and I did not cry. But my throat tightened in the particular way that happens when something true reaches you at the exact moment you are ready to receive it, and I was quiet for a few seconds while that passed. "I think today was a good day," I said. My mother smiled. Her smile is wide and warm, and it does the same thing to her eyes every time, pulling them slightly upward at the outer corners. I have seen that smile my entire life, and I hope I never stop finding it comforting. "Come home safe," she said, "when the term is done." "I will," I said. We said goodbye. The screen went dark. The corridor was quiet. I sat on the floor for a while longer, alone with the hum of the station and the cold stars through the window, and the tiredness that was not exhaustion but something closer to peace. Then I got up. I straightened my jacket. I put the communication device back in my pocket. I walked to my room. I set my notebook on the desk. I looked at the photograph. My mother, my grandmother laughing, my grandfather in his too large hard hat, and I looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that is both familiar and newly meaningful. The way an old photograph can suddenly contain more than it did the last time you looked at it. I sat down at the desk. I opened the notebook to the fresh page I had turned to at the end of class, and I began to write. Not the framework, not the equations, not anything that was going to be presented to anyone. I wrote for myself. I wrote down what the day had felt like from the inside, in the messy, unstructured way that things feel before you have organized them into something communicable. I wrote about standing at the board and hearing the room go quiet. I wrote about Railvo's data link glowing in my peripheral vision. I wrote about Zune 7's complete stillness. I wrote about Velavara in the corridor, straight-spined and serious, telling me something she did not have to tell me. I wrote about my grandmother's handwriting on the kitchen table when I was 14 years old, about the sentence at the top of the page. Each censor was correct. The system was wrong. I wrote, "Today I said things she spent her career knowing, in a language she never learned, in a room she never imagined, to people who had never thought to ask the question her whole life was an answer to." I wrote, "I hope that is enough. I think it might be only the beginning." I closed the notebook. I turned off the desk light. I lay down on the sleeping platform and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and the station hummed around me, steady and old and tireless, keeping everything running in the seams where no one was watching. I fell asleep still thinking about the Velhari relay network, about 612 interface zones, 240 years old, built by 7 separate teams, about all the seams in the galaxy that were quietly waiting for someone to look at them. There was so much still to do. But tonight, I had done enough. The message arrived 2 days after the class. It came through the Academy's internal communication system, which I had used only twice before, once to confirm my room assignment when I first arrived, and once to request an extension on a physics problem set, because I had spent 3 days going down a research path that turned out to be entirely correct but took longer than I had planned. The message was short. It contained no greeting and no explanation. It said only, "Miss Osei, Office 14C, Eastern Faculty Quarter, 7th hour, tomorrow, KV." I read it 3 times. Then I set my communication device face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling. I had known, in the abstract way that you know things are coming before they arrive, that Keth Valos would want to speak with me. The class had ended in a way that left too many threads open. The board still full of my writing, the room still full of that particular serious quiet. 12 minds all holding something that had not been resolved by the end of the session. These things do not simply close by themselves. A professor of Keth Valos's experience and precision would not leave threads of that kind open without choosing to. What I had not known was what closing them would look like. I picked up my device and read the message a 4th time. KV. No title, no full name, just initials, and no explanation of what the meeting would involve. In human academic culture, a message like this from a professor could mean a very wide range of things, from a formal reprimand to a research discussion, to something that defied easy categorization. In Solhari academic culture, which I had been reading about in the evenings to better understand the person I spent 3 sessions a week sitting in front of, I was not entirely sure what it meant. The Solhari, from what I could find, communicated with great precision about the things they wished to communicate, and left everything else entirely unstated. The message had told me where to be and when. It had told me nothing else. I thought about that for a while. Then I opened my notebook and spent the rest of the evening reviewing my framework notes, not because I expected to need them in the meeting, but because reviewing my own work when I am uncertain about something has always been the activity that makes me feel most grounded. It reminds me of what I know, and knowing what I know, clearly and specifically, makes the unknown things feel less like threats and more like questions. Questions I can handle. Office 14C was in the Eastern Faculty Quarter, which was a section of the station I had not been to before. The faculty quarters were older than the student sections, older in the way that institutions tend to build their most permanent spaces first and their most temporary ones later, so that professors who might remain for centuries occupied rooms that had been standing for centuries, while students who would be gone in a few years occupied the newer additions. The corridors here had a different quality of quiet, not the empty quiet of early morning or the anticipatory quiet of a room before a class. A settled quiet, the quiet of walls that had absorbed a very long time's worth of thought. I found 14C without difficulty. The door was a wide panel of dark material I could not identify, set slightly back from the corridor wall in a shallow alcove. There was no display panel beside it, no nameplate, no indicator of occupancy. I stood in the alcove for a moment and decided that knocking on a door that had no visible mechanism for knocking was one of those cross-species situations where you simply did the thing that felt most natural and hoped it translated. I knocked. The door opened immediately, which told me he had been aware I was there before I knocked, which I filed under things to think about later. I stepped inside. The office was large. Not ostentatiously large, not the performed largeness of someone who wants you to feel small in their space, but genuinely large in the way of a room that contains a great deal and needs the space to contain it. 3 of the 4 walls were covered in display surfaces showing what appeared to be ongoing calculations, long, flowing columns of equations and notations in Solhari script, which looked to my eye like a language made of water, all curved strokes and liquid connections. The fourth wall was entirely transparent, looking out into the void, not through an observation window but through what appeared to be nothing at all, as though the wall had simply been removed and replaced with the absence of wall, leaving only the stars and the deep, unmeasurable dark between them. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at that wall. Keth Valos was standing in front of it. His back was to me when I entered. He was looking at the stars the way I sometimes look at them from the residential corridor window, not studying them, not analyzing them, but simply being in the presence of something very large and very old. His translucent form caught the starlight in a way that made the edges of him faintly luminous, so that he looked, from behind, less like a person and more like an arrangement of light that had chosen to take a particular shape. He turned when he heard me step fully into the room. The door closed behind me. "Miss Osei," he said. His three mouths moved in their familiar staggered sequence. "Please sit." There was a chair positioned in the center of the room, a human chair, standard proportions, correct height, the kind of chair that the station's administrative system would have identified as appropriate for my biology, and placed here deliberately. The fact that it was already there told me the meeting had been prepared. He had thought about it before I arrived. I sat down. He remained standing, which put him significantly above my eye line, but I had the impression this was not intentional. It was simply how he occupied space. He moved then, slowly, to a position beside one of the calculation-covered walls, and he stood there with his 4 silver eyes on me, and his 3 mouths in a neutral, composed expression that I had not seen before. It was not the classroom expression. It was not the expression of a teacher addressing a student. It was the expression of someone who was about to speak without the benefit of a prepared framework for what they intend to say. He was, I realized, slightly uncertain. This was so unexpected that I had to work to keep my own expression neutral. "I have reviewed your work from the class," he said. "The complete framework, the 3 components and the secondary failure analysis." He paused. "I have also reviewed the human source materials you cited, the Safety Commission analysis, the post-incident literature from your early 21st century, the aviation safety documentation tradition." Another pause. "I spent considerable time with these materials. I am glad they were accessible," I said. "They were accessible," he said. "They were also—" He stopped. His 3 mouths moved almost imperceptibly, each one adjusting its expression independently, which was the Solhari equivalent of choosing a word carefully. "Illuminating," he said, in a way I had not anticipated. I waited. "The mathematics in your framework," he said, "are not complete. You know this. The topological treatment of the second component requires further development. The interface auditing model needs rigorous formalization. These are things I would say to any first-year student presenting preliminary work." "I understand," I said. "What I would not say to any first-year student," he continued, "is what I intend to say next." He moved slightly, a small shift of his long frame that might, in a human, have been described as a settling, the physical adjustment of someone preparing to say something they have been thinking about for some time. "The conceptual foundation of your framework is sound, more than sound. It identifies something that 8,000 years of Solhari engineering scholarship has not identified in precisely this form." He let that sit between us. The stars continued beyond the transparent wall, cold and indifferent and very beautiful. "That is not a comfortable thing to say," he added, with a directness that I found unexpectedly striking. "I want you to understand that. The Solhari academic tradition does not find it comfortable to acknowledge gaps in its own framework. We have spent a very long time building a very thorough structure of knowledge. The suggestion that a student from a civilization we have barely begun to monitor has identified a genuine gap in that structure is—" Another careful pause. "It requires adjustment." I said nothing. I have learned that there are moments when the most useful thing you can do is remain completely still and let the other person finish arriving at where they are going. "I laughed at you," Keth Valos said. He said it plainly. Not with visible discomfort, not with performance, not with the careful distancing of someone who is acknowledging something embarrassing from a safe remove. He said it the way an engineer writes a finding in an incident report. Directly, precisely, without softening, because softening would be a form of inaccuracy. "You had your hand raised," he continued, "and I laughed, and the room understood what the laugh communicated, and I allowed them to understand it, because I had already decided what your answer would be. I had already filed you in a category." He looked at me with all 4 silver eyes. "That was an error in my methodology." I held his gaze. "An error in your methodology," I said. Yes, I applied a prior assumption to a new data set without examining whether the assumption was valid. This is a precise description of what I teach my students not to do. The three mouths held the same expression, the one from the end of class, the one I had finally named after thinking about it for 2 days. I had decided it was the expression of a mind encountering itself from the outside, seeing its own process reflected in circumstances that made the reflection unavoidable. It is significantly more uncomfortable to make this error than to teach about it. I imagine it is, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I had not expected at all, in the way that the most significant things in any conversation tend to arrive, without announcement, without apparent weight, carrying everything. The Solhari have not faced a genuine engineering crisis in 400 years, he said. He said it the way you say a thing that you have known for a long time, but have not said aloud before. Carefully, because it is true. Carefully, because saying it makes it more present than not saying it did. Our infrastructure is old, he continued, older than your civilization. It was built by the greatest engineering minds our species has produced, over thousands of years, with access to resources and knowledge and time that no other species in this region of the galaxy has had. It functions perfectly. It has always functioned perfectly. A pause. We have never had reason to develop what you described in that classroom. Graceful degradation, interface auditing, the discipline of designing for failure rather than designing for success. His voice was very even, very controlled, in the way that things are controlled when they are close to something significant. We have had no failures to learn from. I sat very still. That, I said carefully, sounds like a considerable advantage. It does, he said. It is. In every measurable respect, infrastructure that does not fail is superior to infrastructure that fails and is repaired. This is not a complicated calculation. He looked at the transparent wall, at the stars beyond it. And yet, he did not complete the sentence. He let it stand unfinished, which was very unlike him. He was a person I had observed across 3 weeks, who completed his sentences with great precision. The unfinished sentence told me something. And yet you don't know what you would do if it did, I said. He turned back from the stars. We do not know what we would do if it did, he confirmed. We have theoretical models. We have academic frameworks for crisis response. We have this course, which I have taught for 60 years, in which I present historical crisis scenarios from other species' records, and we analyze them in the abstract. He looked at me with that undefended, open expression. We have never needed to practice. The word practice landed in the room with a specific weight. I understood it immediately, the way you understand something that you have felt but not articulated. Because practice is not theory, and knowing what to do and having done it enough times that your hands know the shape of it are two entirely different states of readiness. Humans practice constantly. We practice because we fail constantly, and failure is how practice becomes necessary. We practice emergency responses because emergencies happen. We practice system recovery because systems fail. We practice the difficult, uncomfortable, expensive discipline of getting things wrong and learning from the getting wrong, because the alternative is to get things wrong without the learning, which is considerably more expensive. We may not know how to break gracefully, Keth Valos said. He said it without apparent embarrassment and without apparent self-pity. He said it as an engineer states a finding, because it was accurate, and accuracy was more useful than comfort. I thought about how to respond to this for a moment. I thought about what it would mean for an infrastructure 400 years beyond its last genuine crisis to suddenly face one. I thought about the Solhari's theoretical models and academic frameworks, and 60 years of classroom analysis, and all the things that are genuinely useful when everything is working, and genuinely insufficient when it is not. I thought about the specific muscle memory that comes only from having navigated real failure, not once, not in a controlled setting, but repeatedly, across generations, until the navigation becomes instinct rather than calculation. I thought about my grandfather in his too large hard hat, standing in front of a floodgate that he had helped design, not because he was brilliant, but because the previous design had failed, and the failure had taught everyone who looked at it carefully what the next design needed to contain. With respect, I said, and I meant the respect genuinely. It is not only about knowing how to break gracefully, it is about having a culture that has already decided, in advance, that breaking is possible. A culture that has built the expectation of failure into its design process, so that when failure arrives, if it arrives, the response is not improvisation, it is a practice sequence. He was watching me with complete attention. The hardest part of graceful degradation design, I continued, is not the mathematics. The mathematics can be learned. The hardest part is the prior decision. The institutional agreement to sit down before anything has gone wrong and say, this system will fail. Not might fail, will fail. We do not know when, we do not know how, but we are going to design for that failure right now, while everything is working and there is no urgency, because designing for it in the moment of failure is too late and too expensive. I paused. That decision is a cultural one, I said. It requires a civilization to be, in some specific way, comfortable with the idea of its own fallibility, and that comfort, if you can call it that, is not something that can be developed in a classroom. It has to be lived. It has to be the inheritance of a species that has been failing and recovering long enough that failure no longer feels like an accusation. It just feels like information. Kethvalos was very still, in the deep lake way, the way that meant he was working very hard on the inside. You are saying, he said slowly, that what humanity possesses is not a body of techniques. Not only, I said. The techniques are real, and they can be transferred. That is why I presented them. But underneath the techniques is something older. A way of being in relation to the possibility of failure that took a very long time, and a great many actual failures to develop. I looked at my hands for a moment, then back at him. We did not choose to develop it. We simply survived long enough that we had to. The room was quiet. Beyond the transparent wall, the stars turned their slow, ancient turn. I would like to offer you something, Kethvalos said. His voice had returned to its classroom register, clear and deliberate and more composed than it had been a few minutes ago, because he had arrived at a decision, and decisions, for him, seemed to produce clarity rather than consume it. The Academy has a small research division attached to the engineering faculty. It is funded separately from the course curriculum. It addresses questions that the curriculum does not formally cover. He looked at me with all four silver eyes. I would like to propose that your framework, the complete framework, properly developed and formally documented, be submitted to that division as an independent research contribution. I would supervise the development. You would be credited as the primary author. He paused. It would require considerable additional work. The topological formalization alone would take several months, but the contribution, if properly developed, would be significant. I looked at him. I thought about what I had written in my notebook 2 nights ago. I hope that is enough. I think it might be only the beginning. I would like to think about that, I said. He nodded, a slow, single movement that was the Solhari equivalent of respect for the answer. He had not expected me to say yes immediately. He would not have respected me if I had. Take the time you need, he said. It is not a decision to make without consideration. I stood up. I straightened my jacket. I picked up my notebook from my lap, where I had been resting it the whole time without opening it, which was unusual for me. I had not needed it. Everything said in this room had gone directly into a part of my mind where I would be able to find it whenever I needed it. Some conversations are like that. I walked toward the door. Miss Ose. I turned. Kethvalos was standing in front of the transparent wall again, the stars framing him from behind, the light of the room bending around his translucent edges. His 3 mouths held the same expression. His 4 eyes were on me. The question you raised at the end of your presentation, he said. The galaxy's greatest civilizations learned to build things that work. Humanity learned to build things that fail well. A pause. I have been thinking about that question for 2 days. Have you reached a conclusion? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. I have reached the conclusion, he said, that it is the right question. I have not yet reached a conclusion about the answer. I thought about my grandmother, about her desk covered in papers, about the margins of her documents, full of questions she had written down because the questions were the beginning of everything that came after. Neither have I said honestly, but I think that might be the point. I opened the door and walked back into the settled quiet of the faculty corridor, with its old walls and its long absorbed history, and I turned the offer over in my mind as I walked, carefully, slowly, the way you carry something you have not yet decided what to do with but know you will not put down. The station hummed around me. Somewhere in its ancient walls, in the seams between its systems, in the interface zones that no one had ever fully mapped, it continued its patient, tireless work of keeping everything running. I walked back toward the student quarter, thinking about what it means to design for failure, thinking about whether I was ready for what saying yes would mean, thinking, already, about what I would write when I got back to my desk. I said yes 3 days after the meeting in the office. I did not say it dramatically. I did not send a long message with careful qualifications attached. I sent 4 words through the Academy's internal communication system. I have decided. Yes. Kethvalos responded within minutes, which surprised me. I had expected him to take his time. His reply was equally short. It said, "Good, we begin next week." And then, after a pause that I could see in the timestamp difference between the two lines, he added a single sentence that I read several times before I put the device down. It said, "Bring the notebook." 3 weeks after that, things had changed in ways I had not fully predicted, and in ways I had predicted entirely. The thing I had predicted. The work was harder than I expected. Formalizing the graceful degradation framework into the kind of rigorous mathematical document that would be accepted by the Academy's Engineering Research Division was not a simple extension of what I had written on the board. It required me to learn, at speed, the branches of topology I had only partially understood when I first presented the framework. It required Keth Velos to translate concepts from Solhari academic mathematics into forms I could work with, and it required me to translate concepts from human engineering literature into forms he could work with, and the translation process in both directions was slow and imprecise, and occasionally frustrating in the specific way that happens when two precise people are trying to build a shared language from two different starting points. But it was working. The thing I had not predicted, the shift in the room. Lecture Hall 7, third session each week, 12 students. I was still in the back row. I had not moved forward. I did not need to move forward to feel that the room had changed its relationship to my presence in it. It was not that people had become warmer exactly. Warmth is not a universal currency across species, and I had long since stopped measuring the room by human social standards. It was that I had moved from the category of decorative element to the category of participant. When Keth Velos asked questions now, his eyes moved to me as naturally as they moved to the Velhari twins or to Rael Vo or to Zuin 7. When I spoke, the room listened with the quality of attention that means the listening is genuine rather than polite. These are different things. I had learned, over the course of my life, to tell them apart. Rael Vo and I had developed something that was not yet a friendship, but was already more than a professional acquaintance. We had met twice in the Academy's shared study spaces to work through the human safety literature together, he with his precisely arranged tablets and his careful questions, me with my paper notebook and my habit of writing things down before I said them when they mattered. He asked good questions, not the questions of someone building a case or testing a theory, the questions of someone genuinely trying to understand something they had not encountered before. I found, to my own mild surprise, that I enjoyed explaining things to him. Not because explanation makes me feel important, but because explaining something clearly forces you to understand it more completely yourself. And every session with Rael Vo left me understanding something in my own framework that I had not understood quite as precisely before. Zuin 7 had submitted a formal research inquiry to the Academy's Infrastructure Division regarding the Zuin Collective's aging engineering systems. I learned this not from Zuin 7 directly, but from Velavara, who had heard about it through the faculty network. It was early. The inquiry had only recently been submitted, but an inquiry had been submitted, which meant the collective had moved from considering a thing to initiating a process, and a process, once initiated, tends to continue. That is the nature of processes. Velavara herself had, in the quiet way that some people have of doing significant things without announcing them, sent a formal communication to her mother's office at the Velhari Relay Network Authority. She told me this during one of our growing number of corridor conversations, which had begun on the day she found me walking alone, and had continued with increasing regularity since. She told me about the communication factually, without ceremony, in the same register she used for most things, as if it were simply the next logical step after the identification of a relevant problem, which in her understanding it was. Her mother had responded. There was a meeting scheduled. An engineering review of the network's interface zones was being discussed. 612 interface zones, 240 years of age, built by 7 separate teams. The review was being discussed. That mattered. I turned it over in my mind and I let it matter, without inflating it into more than it was. A discussion of a review is not a review. A review is not a redesign. A redesign is not a rebuilt network. These things move in steps, and each step is contingent on the previous one, and the whole process takes longer than anyone beginning it imagines it will. But someone was now watching those seams. That was something. That was, in fact, the beginning of everything. The formal presentation was scheduled for the 22nd day of the second month of term. Keth Velos had arranged it through the Engineering Research Division, and by the time the invitations went out, the audience had grown beyond what I had expected. The division's faculty panel, yes, that was expected. But also a group of senior Solhari engineers who had requested observer status after reading a preliminary summary of the framework. 2 Velhari academic delegates from the mathematics faculty, who had heard about the interface auditing concept and wanted to evaluate its theoretical foundations. A Zuin research representative, Rael Vo, attending not as a student but as a noted observer from the Drathian academic delegation, a distinction that carried its own weight of meaning in Drathian institutional culture. I learned the size of the audience the morning of the presentation. I stood in my small room in the non-standard biological student block and I looked at the list and I was quiet for a long time. Then I looked at the photograph above my desk. My mother in her garden, my grandmother at her desk, laughing. My grandfather in his too large hard hat, looking very pleased with himself in front of a floodgate that had been built because the previous one had failed. I said, to no one in particular, and to all three of them, "This is what you get for raising me the way you did." Then I straightened my jacket and picked up my notebook and went to the presentation hall. The presentation hall was not Lecture Hall 7. It was larger, not enormously larger, not the cavernous auditorium the Academy used for its major faculty addresses, but meaningfully larger. It seated perhaps 60. When I walked in, half of those seats were already filled. I stood at the entrance for a moment and looked at the room, at the faculty panel in the front rows, at the Solhari engineers in their flowing attire along the left side, at the Velhari delegates seated with the particular precision of people who intend to evaluate everything they hear. And I thought about the first day of class, when I had sat in a hall designed for 300 and counted 12 students in the room, and felt the weight of being the only one. This was not that. I was still the only human in the room. That had not changed. But being the only human in a room is not the same experience in every room, and this room was not the room it had been 3 months ago, when the lights in the corridor had flickered before finding the right frequency for my eyes. Something had shifted in the intervening weeks, and the shift was not external. It was not that the room had decided I belonged. It was that I had stopped measuring my right to be somewhere by whether the room had decided it. I walked to the front of the hall. Keth Valos was already there, standing at the edge of the presentation area. He looked at me as I approached, all 4 silver eyes, composed and attentive, and gave the small, precise nod that I had come to understand as his version of a greeting between two people who have been doing serious work together and respect each other for it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," I said. And I was. I opened not with equations. I had decided this the night before, sitting at my desk with the notebook open, planning the structure of the presentation with the same care I would give to the structure of a framework, thinking about what needed to come first, not mathematically, but humanly, because the people in this room were not a class being walked through a problem. They were a mixed group of minds from different traditions and different histories, and before they could engage with a framework they had not encountered before, they needed to understand where it came from and why it existed. So I opened with a story, not a galactic story, not a case from the Academy's incident databases or the Drathian orbital records or anything from the established literature of interstellar engineering. A human story. Several of them, in fact, but told as one continuous thread, the way my grandmother used to tell the stories of the disasters she had studied, connecting each one to the next with the thread of what each had taught the people who came after it. I told them about a reactor in the southeastern United States in 1979, where a combination of equipment malfunction and design gaps and communication failures had produced a crisis that no one system had been built to handle, because no one system had been looking at all the systems at once. I told them what the engineers who examined it afterward had found, and what they had built from that finding, and how the building had changed the practices of the next generation. I told them about Chernobyl in 1986, and what the investigation had uncovered about the relationship between human decision-making under pressure and systems that had not been designed to support good decisions under pressure. I told them about the changes that followed, not only in reactor design, but in the way engineers all over the world began to think about the relationship between human behavior and system architecture. I told them about a blackout in 2003 that had started with a software alarm that failed to sound in a control room in Ohio, and had ended, 4 hours later, with 55 million people without electricity across 8 states and a province of Canada. A cascade. A real one. The kind that crosses boundaries no one expected it to cross, and teaches everyone who studies it the specific shape of how small failures become large ones when the seams between systems are not watched. I told them about the investigations that followed each of these events, about the safety engineers, and the incident analysts and the review boards and the redesign teams, the generations of human beings who had looked at what went wrong and had written down, with great care and great honesty, exactly what they had found, and had built those findings into practices that were then passed to the next generation, who added their own findings and so on, across a century of compounding knowledge. The room was completely quiet. I looked at the faces in front of me, or the equivalents of faces, the sensory surfaces and optical clusters and attentive formations of a dozen different kinds of minds, and I saw what I had come to recognize as the particular quality of attention that a room gives something when it is genuinely engaged. Not politely engaged, not professionally engaged. The deeper kind, where the listening happens in the part of a mind that connects new information to everything it already knows and begins, quietly and without announcement, to reorganize. These events, I said, were not the worst things that happened to humanity. We have had worse. We have had disasters more severe, losses more significant, failures more complete. But these events, and hundreds like them, contributed to something that in retrospect is remarkable. They contributed to a discipline, a body of knowledge that does not exist because anyone sat down and decided to create it, but because a civilization with a particular relationship to failure, an honest relationship, a practiced one, looked at each disaster carefully and asked the same question every time. I paused. What can we learn from this that we did not know before? The room held that. This discipline, I continued, is what I have been attempting to formalize over the past 3 weeks in collaboration with Professor Keth Velos. The framework I am presenting today, the integrated boundary monitoring approach, the graceful degradation design methodology, and the safety documentation management protocol, is not an invention. It is a translation. It is the attempt to take something that exists in the engineering culture of one species and render it in a form that is communicable, transferable, and applicable across different contexts. I moved to the board. I want to be honest about the limitations of what I am presenting. The mathematical formalization is not complete. Several sections require additional development. The framework has been tested against historical scenarios but not against live systems, and the adaptation required for systems significantly different from those in the human engineering literature is not yet fully mapped. I looked at the room. I am a first-year student. This is preliminary work. It is serious preliminary work, and I believe its foundational logic is sound, but I am not standing here to tell you that I have finished something. I am standing here to tell you that something has been started, and that what has been started deserves to be continued. I turned to the board and I built the framework from the beginning, carefully, completely, with every step explained and every assumption stated and every place where the current formalization was incomplete marked honestly as incomplete, because honest incompleteness is more useful than dishonest completeness, which was something my grandmother had written in the margin of a document once and which I had never forgotten. I built it the way she had built things. From the foundation up, from the question that started everything, what happens in the seams, through the measurement framework, through the graceful degradation design, through the documentation management protocol, through the secondary failure analysis, and finally, to the corrected resolution pathway that accounted for what stabilization leaves behind. It took 40 minutes. When I finished, I set down the stylus. I looked at the board, covered, as the classroom board had been 3 weeks ago, in the dense, functional, not quite elegant handwriting that is apparently a hereditary condition in my family. I looked at the room. No one moved. And then Keth Velos did something that I had not anticipated, and that I would carry with me for a very long time. He opened the data interface at the front of the hall. The large display surface above the board came to life, and on it he placed a single document, projected large enough that every person in the room could read it without effort. It was a page from a handwritten document. The handwriting was smaller than mine, more compressed, the writing of someone who had spent a long time learning to put a great deal onto a small piece of paper. The margins were dense with notes. The main text was a failure analysis, written in English, with annotations in 3 other languages that I recognized as the working languages of 3 different countries where my grandmother had consulted during her career. It was her handwriting. I had given Keth Velos a copy of one of her documents 3 weeks ago when he asked to see the primary sources. I had given it to him without thinking about it. It was a document, it was relevant, it was the kind of thing you share when you are doing serious work together. I had not thought about what he might do with it. He had asked permission to include it in the presentation. He had sent a formal message requesting it, and I had said yes, and I had not asked him where in the presentation he intended to use it. I had not imagined this. Her handwriting on a display surface in a Galactic Academy presentation hall, her margin notes, scrawled, dense, full of questions, visible to a room full of ancient civilizations leaning forward to read them. I stood very still. The room was leaning forward. I could see it. The Solhari engineers along the left wall, their translucent forms tilting toward the display. The Velhari delegates, heads angled at the angle of careful reading. Rael Vo, his stylus resting on his knee, his full attention on the handwritten page. Zuan 7, every eye rotated toward the screen. Keth Velos spoke. This document, he said, in his full harmonic voice, was written by Adwoa Ose, a nuclear safety engineer who spent 40 years working across 4 continents. She was not a famous person. She did not produce landmark publications or receive institutional recognition. She spent her career reading failure reports, asking questions that were sometimes considered inconvenient, and writing down what she found in the margins of other people's work. He paused. She died 11 years ago. I was looking at her handwriting on the screen. What you see in her margin notes, Kethvalos continued, is the beginning of the framework that Miss Osei presented today, not in its formalized form, not in the mathematical language we have been working to develop, but in its essential logic, in the questions she kept asking across 40 years of work that no one else at the time thought to compile into a framework because they were too busy answering the immediate problems to notice that the questions beneath them formed a pattern. He let the image hold for a moment. The framework we are presenting today, he said, is not the work of a first-year student who had a good day in class. It is the work of a first-year student who inherited something, who was raised in the company of people who paid very close attention to what went wrong, and why, and what it meant for what came next. Who brought that inheritance into a room and recognized, when the moment arrived, that it had something to offer the room. He looked at me, all 4 silver eyes, composed, serious, open. The galaxy has many things to teach humanity, he said. It appears that humanity also has things to teach the galaxy. Both of these statements can be true at the same time. They are not in competition. He closed the document. The room was quiet. I sat down in the nearest chair because my legs had decided, without consulting me, that standing was no longer strictly necessary. I sat down and I looked at my hands in my lap and I took a slow, careful breath. The kind that is not about air but about returning to yourself after a moment that has briefly taken you somewhere outside your usual borders. Then I looked up. The faculty panel chair, a Solhari elder whose name I had been told but whose face I was still learning to read, spoke first. She had questions, precise, careful, penetrating questions about the mathematical formalization and the topology and the specific conditions under which the secondary failure probability model would need to be adjusted for different system scales. Good questions. The questions of someone who had understood the framework well enough to know exactly where its current edges were. I answered them, carefully, honestly, noting each place where the answer was complete and each place where it was not yet. After the faculty chair, others spoke, the Solhari engineers, the Velhari delegates, a long, thoughtful exchange with Zune 7's representative about the specific challenges of applying interface auditing to a collective intelligence's inherited infrastructure. A question from Rael Vo, the best question of the entire session, about how the documentation management protocol would function in a system where the original design records had been partially lost, which was, as he noted quietly, not an abstract scenario in the Drathian orbital network. The session ran an hour longer than scheduled. Nobody left. When it ended, people came forward. Not all of them, but enough. The Solhari engineers wanted to speak about applications to their own long stable infrastructure, because Kethvalos had been right, and his admission in the privacy of his office had been both honest and necessary, and now other Solhari engineers were sitting with the same admission and working out what it meant for systems that had not been stress-tested in 4 centuries. The Velhari delegates wanted to discuss the interface auditing methodology in formal terms for potential inclusion in a standards review. Rael Vo stood at the edge of the group and caught my eye and gave the small, precise bow he had given me in the corridor after the class that started all of this. I received all of it with as much steadiness as I could manage, which was considerable, because I had prepared for this even though I had not known I was preparing for it. Every late night with the notebook, every margin question, every slow, careful conversation in a study room or a corridor, it had all been practice for standing in a room and being present in it fully, without shrinking and without performing. I was just present. A human girl from Accra, on a space station 400 light-years from home, standing in the place where her grandmother's handwriting had just been read by civilizations that had been reaching for the stars since before her species had learned to write. It was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing I had ever done. Later, much later, after the hall had emptied and the display surface had gone dark and the station had begun its evening light cycle, I walked back to my room alone. The corridors were quiet. The lights pulsed in their warm, slow rhythm, adjusting automatically for my visual spectrum, finding the right frequency now without flickering. They had learned. It had only taken them a few weeks. I sat down at my desk. I looked at the photograph. I looked at my grandmother's laughing face, at her desk covered in papers, at the margin notes I could almost read at this distance because I knew them by heart. I opened my notebook. At the top of the fresh page I wrote a date. Then I wrote one sentence. In the careful handwriting I had been told since childhood was a terrible match for hers, which meant it was actually very similar. I wrote, "The seams are not someone else's responsibility, they belong to everyone who touches them." Then I wrote, smaller, underneath, in my own words and not hers, the thing I had understood today more fully than I had understood it before today. We did not come here to prove that we belong among the stars. We have been surviving impossible things for 100,000 years. That was never in question. We came here to share the notes. I closed the notebook. I looked at the stars through the small window above my desk. Cold, plentiful, extraordinary. Nothing like the sky above Accra, and nothing that would ever replace it, and not required to, because two things can both be real, and neither has to erase the other. I thought about the Velhari relay network and its 612 unseamed interface zones. I thought about the Solhari infrastructure, 400 years beyond its last crisis, running perfectly in every seam no one had examined. I thought about Zune 7's aging systems and Railvo's lost design records and every ancient, brilliant, confident civilization in this galaxy that had been so successful for so long that it had never had reason to sit down and ask the uncomfortable question underneath every working system. How long? And in which seams? And who was watching? There was so much work still to do. The kind of work that takes not weeks or months but years and decades. The kind that gets passed from one person to the next and from one generation to the next, accumulating slowly the way all real knowledge accumulates, through patience, through honesty, through the willingness to look at what went wrong and write it down and keep looking. My grandmother had done it for 40 years and never been famous for it. I had just started. I turned to the next page, and I began.